something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
Salutations, New Haven. Happy summer, and to all you teachers who are finally having a July and you're praying that it never ends, hoping you're having a wonderful time. Today we have a special guest. We have a civil rights attorney, and I have been doing shows on inequity in our public schools for about 2 years now, probably even longer than that. And I haven't looked at it from this legal position, and lots of scholars will say to me, we need to change the laws, we need to do this. And I'm always looking at, and policy, people talk about policy and the laws. So today we're going to get a little glimpse of what this means. How does the law impact the quality of our public education? And, I'll begin with that, that we say we spend $23 billion more annually in this country on predominantly wealthy white schools than we do on poor schools and schools of color. And I've said that at conferences in Europe, and they freak out. The European countries will say to me, don't they know that's inequitable, that's wrong? Isn't someone going to jail? And so maybe we need to have some kind of laws that put some of these people behind bars or something, or at least, but it came to Amelia and I had a little conversation online about this, and it's kind of like, I feel like we have to legalize equity, because maybe what we've done for 50 states with different laws, different districts, Connecticut's got 159 school districts, in it, with different rules and different procedures and the policies that we face. And so maybe what we need to think about is, can we not only shift policy, but can we create the law that formulates the policy? And that's important, because in Connecticut, I like to call Connecticut we don't get enough mandates, legal mandate state. If we pass a law that says every child will read by tomorrow, and then we spend hundreds of billions of dollars on stuff that doesn't deliver any results. But anyway, I'd like to have you introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your passions and your work. Amelia.
Thank you, Jesse. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here today. And a little bit about myself. I'm a Cajun critter from Southeast Louisiana, below New Orleans by way of Bayou Lafourche and Bayou St. John. I was a member of the original first year of AmeriCorps in the New Orleans Youth Action Corps on an education team, 94, 95. And I taught conflict resolution and environmental ethics in elementary and middle schools in Gentilly and Mid-City, New Orleans. And then I went on to Loyola University and into the construction industry, where I was a brownfield project manager supervising environmental cleanups for several years. And then I remained very active in public education. And then when Katrina hit, I found my own neighborhood was the ground zero for what they were calling at the time the experiment in market-driven public education. And so I remained very active with the charter schools coming in. I became a watchdog of charter schools and the state operated system, both as an active community member and a mom in the public schools. And a few years later, when the schools were still rough, and the city was in rough shape, a few years after Katrina, I moved to Central Arkansas, where I was still a day's drive from home. And I was able then to finish my degree and get a law and master's degree, where I made the central theme finding solutions to the problems of public education in America. And in that process, I was able to, in 2013, I spent a summer at Nuestra Escuela in Puerto Rico. And We're going to talk about that in a minute. And then a few days after I took the bar, I was hired by Mr. John W. Walker, who was one of the very first interns at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund back in the 1960s. And Mr. Walker was in his mid 70s when I met him, and he hired me immediately. And he said I was the one with the heart for the work in the office. And he threw me in the deep end, and he really let me find my place in his firm. He was still litigating the successor cases to Cooper v. Aaron, which is the Little Rock Nine case. And I found that advocating for students with disabilities and children in the juvenile adjudication process was a real need. And through that work, I became a subject matter expert in the school to prison pipeline. So now my education related legal work falls into three buckets. I have individual representation, which I do from advocacy to litigation. And second, I still do public accountability, freedom of information requests, policy watchdogging, that kind of thing. And then third, solutions oriented work, policy change, legal reform. And I'd like to do more of that.
All right. It sounds like something we need. And I've just thought that in 1954 with Brown versus the Board of Topeka, isn't this all over with? Are we, because you talked about Mr. Walker still litigating the Arkansas Nine. I'm like, is that what we did? We created a law, a desegregation law, and then we've been litigating it ever since? Is that what's been going on?
Certainly, there are still cases open and school districts that are still under consent decrees or court orders to desegregate, but we are definitely still living in the era of post-board, Brown v. Board.
And we have in Connecticut, we just had a recent report that said that our schools are more segregated than they were 30 years ago. So it's, and some of this has come through charters and magnets, and we've had a case, a significant case here was Chef versus O'Neill, which was a case that was trying to solve the issue of racial isolation. And so that case has been going. It gets renewed every few years and stuff. But when I look at it, I'm not seeing any, real solving the issue. When I look basically at it, it's sort of like we will work to save 25% of the children, black and brown children in Offutt, and the other 75, well, we'll wait for another day or something. It's a strange piece of legislation. It has some good points and it has some really bad points. It's certainly not bringing equity, or it's certainly not desegregating Offutt schools. They're more segregated today than they were before the Chef O'Neill piece. It's almost as if the solution that came from Chef versus O'Neill becomes a thing that sort of exacerbated the segregation issues. They were supposed to desegregate issues, and it's really hard in a state like Connecticut, a blue state, with 159 school districts. We are a very small state, and I don't know how we could have so many of them, but it's an interesting place. So let's think about helping the audience. There's this legal structure of public education, and you're going to explain to us there are some issues with it, and the issues you're going to talk about who benefits from it and who gets harmed from it, and that's what I'm wondering, because a lot of the solutions that seem to be popping up, like the Chef O'Neill case, we might be harming, if I'm looking at that case, 75% of the children of color who we're not doing anything for. So if you can explain to us that, what is the public education, the structure, and what kinds of problems do we have? It's sort of like, that's why I said we should be doing legalized equity, because it seems to me every case that we do, I'm not saying I'm not a legal scholar, but so much seems to put us down. I've got them over here on my desk. Jonathan Kozel's 84 book, Savage Inequalities, and now his new book is We Shall Not Bow Down. So I've been rereading the Savage Inequalities and reading the new book and stuff. But I don't think the public really understands the structure of public education and the issues with it legally. Can you help us understand that?
Definitely. And I would like to just briefly mention the recent NPR series about disparate discipline in Illinois high schools in Springfield, Illinois. And they're doing research that shows that Black students are being disciplined for the same offenses at grossly disproportionate rates. So it's my overarching premises after studying this subject very deeply for years that the very systems that we have put into place perpetuate these inequalities and they create new ones. And if we went back to the decision in Brown v. Board and that era, we also had the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and there was a mandate to study desegregation and equity. And then there was the Coleman Report, which the central recommendation of the Coleman Report was equitable funding and true integration of schools across not just race, but demographics. And there was so much resistance to that when the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 passed, it did not really address desegregation. It perpetuated a lot of the same structures and it created some punitive structures. And what we've experienced, especially in the Delta, is, there's some truth to these phrases about the soft bigotry of low expectations, and that the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and its successor laws, No Child Left Behind and the ESSA, they perpetuate these funding models that basically incentivize poverty and school failure. And so I've heard it even said that there are superintendents that literally throw a party when they get designated a Title I school because they consider it a cash cow and nobody really has expectations that the children will succeed. And what we've seen in New Orleans is this constant churn due to the No Child Left Behind transformation models, where students have experienced numerous school closures over a short education career. But let me back up just for a minute and address the overarching big structure. As I mentioned, we have the ESEA, No Child Left Behind, and the ESSA at the federal level. And we also have some disability rights laws. We have IDEA, ADA, Section 504. But we do not at the national level have a plain iteration of students' rights, students' responsibilities, and student and classroom standards that are sensitive to creating a broad national standard versus individual states, which are creating these very detailed standards that are constraining education more and more and allowing our practical and interpersonal skills to atrophy. So we're teaching students more and more specific things and siloing them into block hours that is robbing them of the ability to think clearly and see patterns and read literature and all of these things that just a few years ago were taken for granted. These school models are based on every student taking a standardized test every year. That's not the standard. That's not how these tests were designed. That's not how other nations are measuring the quality of their schools. So we have federal laws, we have state laws, and then we have local school districts and local schools. At the state level, we've had education rights in state constitutions far longer than we've had federal laws. And the states vary wildly. And you keep mentioning Connecticut, and it sort of breaks my heart because as a Southerner, we often look to you all to say, look at, they're spending $17,000 a year per student, and we're spending eight. So it's disheartening to see that these issues occur, so broadly, but we have such disparate systems within the United States, within states, and even within districts, where, for example, Little Rock School District has some beautiful, phenomenal facilities in wealthy white areas, and really, poor areas have facilities you would never
We're going to ask you to go
and of
closer
course,
to
we
the
know.
computer
Okay.
or your mic.
Sorry.
Yeah.
And then we know that the quality of school facilities, natural light, air quality, all of these things influence school performance. So we have federal, state, and local laws. And then we also have charter schools, which may be authorized by a local district or state. We have now private schools accepting vouchers and homeschool programs that are not subject to the same accountability schemes as the public schools. And because public schools are, in some cases, actively harming children and their stakeholders, people are divesting from public education instead of fixing the problems. So, and just a side note, I'm still a little mad at President Obama for Race to the Top. And I think he really doubled down on harmful practices, and we're still dealing with that as well. And the idea that public schools within a community should be competing with each other for resources and high-performing students is really destructive to communities. And like, for example, in New Orleans, where you have an all-charter district, you have families who are broken apart, and you'll have different children going to different schools, and nobody's going to the neighborhood school, and everybody's competing for everything. And it's really caused a lot of breakdown in society.
Sure. It's almost as if the move to privatize has put a market value on children, and we're thinking about how we can profit off them. And so we don't send them to the best school. We send them to the school that somebody can make the most money or profits off them. It's funny when you were talking about Arkansas, and you said there are some really beautiful schools in white communities and some other schools, but that's Connecticut as well. So when I look at this issue, this is a nationwide issue. Do we spend more in Connecticut? Yes, we do, but we spend more for mortgages, we spend more for rent, we spend more to eat, we do all that. So it's sort of like, I have a daughter who's 35 years old. Her rent in Queens, New York is twice my mortgage, and that's just the rent for the apartment. So when we talk about the comparison of what one state, average spends versus another, it's not a good piece. But yeah, it may seem on paper like we spend more money. But we've done shows recently like, where are all of our librarians? I've got public schools, and it only seems to be in communities of color that libraries are closing, and there's no certified librarian staff in the schools. And this is a common thing now. We looked at the data, Dr. Robert Codle and I, and we found that in Hartford, the city of Hartford, that would be a district that we often talk about when we talk about equity. Now, Hartford's not our biggest school district. Bridgeport, Connecticut is, but same issue, same place. But they were down I think when Robert and I we looked at 5 years, we're down to half the amount of librarians in those public schools. So, and it's not only librarians. I've worked for years with teachers in public schools in the area. There's no more music teachers. There are no more art teachers. It seems, and it's interesting because if you don't have music, you don't have art. The only thing I enjoyed by the 250 celebration was New Orleans. They were on TV sharing the music. New Orleans and Nashville had a wonderful birthday party with great musicians and great talent and stuff. But if we take music and art, we take librarians out, you know, it's unbelievable stuff over there. So yeah,
And
the inequality.
if I
Yeah.
may, it
Yes.
may upset some people, but another thing that we have tracked is the exponential rate of spending on administrators and standardized tests and curricula. And so my calculations show that we could produce better outcomes on a more cost efficient basis if we had master educators, smaller classrooms, and less layers of administrators and less of these mandated purchases for these tests and curricula that are clearly not meeting our needs.
Yeah, and that's a common thing. So, uh, what I'd like to know is you study comparative law. And so I'm not certain what comparative law is, and I'm not sure how you apply it to these problems of inequity because I'm look at American public schools and I say systemic racism, structural racism. I can't. I look at the history of public education and say from day one we were inequitable. So can you tell us about comparative law and how that applies to this issue?
Thank you so much for letting me talk about one of my favorite subjects. So comparative law and a subset of comparative law is called functionalism. And this is the study of different legal systems to seek solutions from a broader solution field. So you can see more possible solutions when you look nationally and internationally than if you just look within your own system. And so it's just studying other systems of law and questioning how might this apply in the American legal context.
So you gave us some examples. I think when I looked at, you and I have talked Finland and of all places, Puerto Rico's education laws as models. So could you help us understand that? So what's the I do know when I go to Europe, they can't believe the way we fund our schools. Uh, they really believe we're corrupt, and I probably have to agree with them. The school to prison pipeline in many ways, but they often just say to me, "How come no one's in jail? How come don't they know that's unethical and stuff?" Those are I get that at every conference that I go to. I go to the European literacy conferences, and we'll talk about literacy and good practices and poor practice. Really, it comes down when I'm presenting about the American system. I'm really talking about the good practices are in wealthy communities with lots of resources, and they're predominantly white. And the poor practices are in poor communities where the teachers are overworked, the parents are overburdened, the students are in essence joining that school to pipeline prison. So what is it about Finland, and then what is it about Puerto Rico? Because that was when you put them in the list, I was in shock because I'm like, are you telling me that Puerto Rico is the model? And I really want to hear about those things.
Sure, thanks. So uh, I took comparative law to satisfy my law school's upper level writing requirement, kind of like a thesis. And I just recognized that I had this unique opportunity to really focus on what would legal solutions to the problems of structural education in the United States look like. And I originally thought that I would look at ESEA, at SEEK, and amend those laws. And I began reading them. And that's when I really realized the fundamental premises here are flawed. We really need to just scrap it. And I'm a transcendentalist. I'm a follower of Emerson and Thoreau. And I really value this idea of let's simplify our practices and elevate our purposes. And when you marry that with the idea in comparative law that things have to work in the American legal context. So for the solution to work. So I initially started with a broad field of exploration, and I really looked around the world at different education systems. And of course, a lot of people have said that they wished that our schools looked more like Finland's. So I dove into Finland's law, and I found that when I looked at their Basic Education Act, I think it's 2012, it it has a lot of items in it that really would work in the American legal context. And then I looked at Puerto Rico because part of the comparative law analysis is really stating your values and your assumptions. And what I really wanted was systems where every child is valued and funding is equitable and educators are respected. And, there's not this move towards mass standardization. And so there's the Finland's Basic Education Act, but when you look at it, it does not address everything that we would need for a new public education system. But when you weave in Finland's Alternative Schools Act, you get a really lovely whole, with some
Right.
Native original American pieces, but the Finland's Alternative Schools Act provides, like Finland's, Puerto Rico and Finland both provide for meaningful local control, which is a lot of what charter schools were sold to us as and haven't actually turned out that way. But they also provide for biological, psychological, social supports for students, for master educators, for facilities that are responsive to their natural environments. So, and there's just lots of values about, again, all children are welcome and wanted and loved, that we really are missing that element nowadays of everything being competitive, and children are disposable, and it's really quite heartbreaking. So it's not in all schools, it's not everywhere, but it is a dominant theme. And there are schools right down the street from each other where one school wants kids to show up even if they aren't having a good day, even if they're late, even if they're not in uniform, they want them there. And there's another high school, I'm thinking of two particular schools, and the other high school, the public high school, they'll turn them away at the door, for any of those things. So we really need to change our whole attitude towards children and teachers and the environment altogether.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I've had some friends from New Orleans, so parent Karen Royal Harper, and Reynard Sanders, who are from New Orleans, and they've talked a lot about the charter schools were not responsible to the communities. They were responsible to the board. And the board were people who didn't live in the communities and were profiting off the schools. So that's another misconception. So I've opened a charter school, and it was during that time when Arnie Duncan charterized New Orleans. He took away local input into the school system. So yeah, so if the Finland keeps that in there, and we have ways to build it into the law, that no public school, no school should be responsible to a board who are private equity people. They should be responsible to the community. And we noticed we've got it in Connecticut, one of the biggest fights where we were moving to get rid of elected boards. So Hartford's board, the mayor appoints a majority of the board. So the mayor always controls the board. And if you're an old political person like me from New Jersey, where corruption was every day, the last thing we want to do is give the mayor more power. We don't want that. Mayors and governors with more power. No, we don't. But it's this piece about who do our public schools serve, what is their purpose, and if we can somehow make laws that we can. When my European friends at the conferences will say, "Well, don't they know that's inequitable?" They point to laws, just like you said. So they'll tell me that we will increase funding to schools with higher refugee populations, higher special needs populations, and it's built into their law. So the funding law, so it brings some resources right away, because even when I look at Brown versus the Board of Topeka, I have some friends who went to all black schools I'm 71 years old, before Brown versus the Board of Topeka, and they'll say, you know, those all black schools were great places. We were well educated. We were educated by black teachers who had a love of black culture and history and stuff like that. But the reason for the fight with the NAACP, they'll say to me, is that we don't necessarily want to, we don't think of, if my son or my daughter who's black goes to an all white school, they'll become smarter. But what we know is there are resources there, and the resources that this country's not comfortable providing black and Hispanic communities over there. So I'm thinking about this. You say this is a way this current structure can be changed, and some people are harmed and some people benefit. Who exactly benefits from the structure that we have now?
So right now we have what I call unilateral accountability. We have only downward accountability. We do not have upward accountability. We know we have these structural problems. We know these curricula, these off-the-shelf factory model curricula don't work anymore. But we really find ourselves, it's a struggle to hold anyone accountable. And I could certainly spend a whole hour talking about the issues with school boards and nonprofits, right? But the fact is, democracy is messy. And so we can't get away from that. We need to create structures where we can have local oversight with and I think this is where technology actually could be helpful, you know, things like blockchain and participatory budgeting, where we could have, you know, people who can be active to the extent they're able, you know, without everybody having to do everything or, you know, it being too much. But right now, I've known Renard Sanders and Karen Royal for over 20 years now, and was, you know, contributed to Dr. Sanders' book with my research. And what we saw in post-Katrina New Orleans was we had good laws on the books about converting schools to charter schools, where they required, for a conversion, they required a vote of the existing school community, the teachers and parents and local community. And in numerous occasions, they simply just did not have they just didn't hold the vote. They just went ahead and did the charter. And what they did is they put on these charter boards people who were very connected to Tulane, to the existing, you know, charter proponents networks. And they had certain charter management organizations, CMOs, that they wanted to plug into these schools. And my neighborhood of Mid-City, immediately after Katrina, we wanted our local public school, elementary school open, John Dibert. We organized ourselves as a committee of our neighborhood organization, which was older than me. And we had outstanding retired educators and an accountant and a lawyer. We had our whole little group. And I was the parent representative, and we went and we tried to charter our school, because the state told us that was the only way we could get our neighborhood school open. And then we got all the way down the line. At the very end, they told us, well, you can only have this charter if you agree to hire this particular management company to operate your school. And we already had educators and, you know, all the resources we needed within our own community. And so the leadership actually turned it down. They said, this is not what we signed up for at all. And so what you have in New Orleans, I can speak to, is self-perpetuating unelected boards. And so they don't hold elections, they don't hold public nominations, they barely hold public meetings. There are lots of issues. And so it has become impossible for local stakeholders to meaningfully oversee or even track what's going on. And there are lots of issues. They just announced the closure of an important high school and they released board minutes that said, oh, well, we talked about this in executive session a few meetings ago, but now we're just announcing the closure. And this was a school in a critical location downtown that's gentrifying. And we used to have Crescent City Peace Alliance and Riders at the Center, where, we had strong community involvement in that school, and it was taken over by KIP. And and now it's being closed. So there's real estate interests, and these historic New Orleans buildings, many of those closed schools have turned into condos, and then they've consolidated the smaller neighborhood schools into these much larger schools that are now overseen by these self-appointed, self-perpetuating boards. And they are purchasing off-the-shelf curricula and standardized tests, and there aren't really good options, alternative options in terms of Montessori or Waldorf or other proven models that will not participate because they will not agree to all this standardization. So who benefits are the people who are already at the top and already, people who are administrators, but they're not day-to-day contributing to direct instruction or supporting direct instruction. There are real estate developers and these massive curricula and testing providers. And who's really suffering is, we can speak to our most vulnerable children, but what I'm seeing also is just everyday kids, families that just don't want their kid sitting at a desk all day. We have a system of education that has become very separated from human development. We have expectations that little kids are going to sit all day in desks in front of screens, regurgitating, responding to directives like adults would never stand for. So it's not just our most vulnerable, but they are the most affected. But lots of children across the spectrum. I mean, I realized one day, we are mass medicating 8-year-olds because they can't sit still. Why are we having a conversation about why are we expecting all our 8-year-olds to sit still all day? So we've just really just divorced education from human development and what we need as a nation to serve our own interests as a society, as the physical environment, and in a world with a finite biosphere.
And it's interesting when we talk about this to help people understand it. Dr. Jerome Harsty from Indiana University, who talks about an inquiry as education. And that's really about what do children have to say? What do they want? What are the questions they want to answer and stuff? And he's talked about this current form piece going by. And he says, we have effective, education, and we have cognitive education. And the effective education is what makes you want to learn. It's what those teachers who can motivate you are, over there. And he said, we have seen to take that all away and see that as evil or soft education. And we have all these cognitive things like rules and regulations and stuff, especially in literacy. It's like, I'm of an age that the first time a teacher asked me to read a novel, I was in the 9th grade. I grew up in a very urban, very poor, Black and Latino community, and my cousins were reading books all along, and so was I. I would go to the library, and then I'm like, whoa, I've just read, The Count of Monte Cristo. That was a great book. And my teachers would be like, you read that book? Over there. And it wasn't on there. Everything was in a bridge or a short version. And so I like to say that children need a purpose to learn, and they need a say in what, learning. And, if you want them to read, you got to give them something worth reading. So that's what I'm hearing you saying there. And these new entities are sort of, as it was, so Jerome Harsty would say, they're pushing the effective elements of education out of the curriculum. That's when we talk about these box curriculums. It's sort of like, you know, if you stand on your head and you're upside down, you'll be able to read the book by the age of 3 or something. Some ridiculous kind of piece over there, not realizing that we have over 1 million homeless children in our school. We have over 1 million children in our public schools that have incarcerated at least one parent or two parents incarcerated. We have children who come to school hungry. We have all kinds of issues going on. Uh, and this stuff, and imagining that I could get rid of that affected piece. It's sort of like when I'm looking at the curriculum in the boxes, they're like trying to teacher proof. When what we really need to do is bring the teacher back into the play. Because when people used to talk about differentiation, and for the radio audience, differentiation is where I adjust the curriculum to reach a student who has different needs and learns differently. And really, only the teacher can do that. You can't get that in a box. So the more and more you take the teacher out, you have a problem. And then why, it's just a major component over there. So I'm not seeing any of these ed reform or these curriculums in boxes. They're not delivering. I'm looking at the data. A month and a half ago, I was up in Massachusetts at the Board of Ed arguing that they have a new piece of legislation, the right to read. And I'm like telling them, this is Groundhog Day. The assessments that you use to say whether your children are successful readers or not require massive failure. So, whatever you do today, if you're going to spend $1 billion on this bill to change the reading curriculums, of course, they wanted box curriculums in there. And I'm like, you should be spending that money on special education teachers, counselors, social workers, books, all kinds of things, librarians. How could you be letting your librarians go? But I told them it was Groundhog Day, because 5 years from now, I'm going to look at that data, and the data is going to show what you've done has to have massive failure. Otherwise, it can't be standardized. Yes, there's a close relationship between standardizing education, standardizing test scores. It's something, and often when I see policies and state laws, at least in Connecticut, we like to legislate mandates that require curriculums, and these curriculums are usually for poor school districts, black and brown school districts. They don't have a choice. It's not that much different than what you described in New Orleans. I must buy this curriculum. My teachers must teach this curriculum no matter what. Whether it works or not doesn't matter in that sense. So that's a part of the stuff. So I wonder if this element, so Diane Ravitch in her work really calls this the privatization of public schools, and people profiting off this, because why would you do this? Why would you take the humanity out of the school? That's certainly not going to help children. But one of the things,
Since I may right there, just jump in for a sec.
Sure,
the way that we have talked about that is intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. And these systems that are very structured, very discipline oriented, are really about extrinsic motivation. So students are just responding to prompts, politeness is emphasized over critical thinking and so forth. And tying that back to the Constitution and our national interest, the way that I say it is we are being all Americans that are in these systems are being denied the blessings of liberty because they're being denied meaningful self-determination. And focusing, and the way Professor Nell Nodding says it, sameness is not equality. So giving everyone the same thing, which, now for years, and I said this when it was happening, everybody was being told, you have to do STEM, you have to do tech, you have to do coding. That's the future. Everybody's going to be a coder. And I was saying, no, this is not, and ever saying every child in New Orleans is college bound is going to leave us without artisans and craftspeople that we need to preserve our housing stock. So, now we have these massive tech corps doing layoffs. And people with advanced computer science degrees can't find jobs that they could find just a few years ago. And in the meanwhile, we've oriented our whole school system towards this tech heavy system that is denying so many students basic life skills, but also compelling them to find a career before they have a chance to find their calling.
Yeah, but if we're eliminating those artisans, well, who fixes the plumbing? Who does the electricity? Who replaces the masonry in your chimney, and all these things like that? And these are viable and creative things. And the artist, we're not talking about the artist, the musician. So, like I say, on the 250th anniversary, I was watching two. I think it was on ABC or Disney. I watched Nashville and I watched New Orleans. Those are the places where the music, and I felt I was getting a good sense of Americana in those places and stuff over there. But all right, so now we got an idea about this, and you focused on Finland and Puerto Rico because they're there. Now, how would that work here? What could we do?
So what I came up with and what I propose is a new system of public education for the United States that could operate at the federal level or state level. If there were any states out there that want to try something new, this is a solid theoretical and philosophical framework. And I should mention that what I did is I organized my analysis along the clauses of the preamble of the Constitution. So this is why we come together as a nation. So when you look at each clause, are our schools meeting this? And if not, how could they? And I also wove in the works of Professor Nell Noddings and Professor David Orr, whom I greatly admire, education philosophers. And then when I was done, I sent this to them and they both gave it their blessings. So I just felt that was really special, and that was years ago. And what we're experiencing now is so relevant that I really felt like it's time to share this work that I have kept just sort of close to me, like my little baby, for a long time. So what that could look like in law is, at the federal level, if we created a new center to administer these schools, it would be in a support role. And it would do some quality assurance and some oversight and distribution of funds. But basically, along the model of Finland, we need to fund public schools such that we fund for every student in the area, not simply head counts at the beginning of the school year. So public schools should be funded equitably for every child. Students, we need a bill of student rights and responsibilities. Students are able to carry some responsibilities in their schools, but we need to clearly articulate their rights, which presently both Finland and Puerto Rico have in their legislation, and state constitutions have that students have rights to education. But we don't have that at the federal level outside of disability law. We really have disparate discipline. It's very subjective, and it can vary it varies very vastly within states, within districts, within schools. So if we had some broad outlines of, in consideration of due process laws and court cases, what does discipline look like, and providing for the removal of disruptive students, and so forth, but in a way that is consistent across the board. So we could have student assignment, educator qualifications, all of these things at the national level, the way that Finland does, with a very simple, bare bones, criteria for standardization of curricula that gives the master educators broad room to administer and make real, and doing a lot of project-based experiential learning. But like literacy, where we have phonics and literacy, and there needs to be a balance, with student-led and teacher-led education. There needs to be a balance, and students need to have places where they can have input into the direction of their education much sooner than we give it to them now. And we could allow for other well-established models such as Montessori and Waldorf to become public school models if we're not requiring mass standardized tests every year. And so really we can do away with so much of that. The students need to take tests periodically. I'm not saying they don't, but they do not need anything like the regiment that they are getting now. And they need much more diagnostic testing, and so forth. In my individual representation of children in the school to prison pipeline, I quite often see students where the school has claimed to have done an educational evaluation for dyslexia, other learning differences. And what they've actually done is a mental health evaluation. And then they've diagnosed the kid with oppositional defiant disorder, but they haven't bothered to find out, why does this only show up when the kid receives a worksheet from the teacher and can't complete the worksheet, and tells the teacher they can't complete the worksheet, and nothing changes except for doubling down on the kid as being defiant because they won't complete the worksheet. And we have so much of like a worksheet and computer driven education model right now that I propose that we ground ourselves in the uniquely American philosophy of transcendentalism, which connects humans, nature, integrity, and wonder. And so how that looks can be very different. But another thing just to quickly mention is we're losing vernacular knowledge. And, as our generations age and our climate changes, we must preserve and perpetuate local, old and new ways of living in a finite biosphere and with each other as communities and citizens. So what I envision and propose is a new public education system that, as Thoreau said, strips away the cluttered furniture, tripped up by its own traps, and instead simplifies our practices and elevates our purposes.
So we've taken the creativity, the imagination, the uniqueness out of the child, out of them. We've said it's almost as if they're on the assembly line of a Model T Ford, and either you come out as that acceptable Model T Ford, or you don't come out over there. And the kind of some interest. And so the lore can help us. That's what our show has been about. And so when we think about that, I'm wondering, this new education philosophy or system, could you try to give us a gist in a minute or two? I know that's hard. I mean, we're talking about sophisticated ideas, but just so Joe Public would understand, what would be the difference between the public education system that you're proposing and what's currently in place? Hard task, that one.
Thanks. And we've started that, we've addressed that, but the idea would be of imagine local public schools based in the community that have genuine local input and oversight as to how they are governed and their budgets and so forth, but also where, maybe there's a later start time, and guaranteed recesses and lunches, and natural human development milestones are part of the school design. So we're not fighting with children's biologies just to get them to be productive in the classroom. They have a lot of opportunities for experiential learning and project-based learning that is a mix of what they're studying and what they want to study, where they're not being moved from classroom to classroom every hour or every 2 hours, where they are in more of a workshop. And the key thing here is, and this is an important critical thing right now, what we have, and I have children who are dear to my heart, who are busy, or strong-willed, or any of those things that cause them to be disruptive in the classroom. We need classrooms that are more like community lunchrooms, where there's a lot of different things going on, but all different types of children with all different types of abilities can be together in the same space and not be disruptive, because they're not all being asked to be all quiet all the time at the same time. And if we could meaningfully integrate our classrooms across ability levels, we would have so much less hardship for children with autism, children with serious disabilities, being marginalized to least restrictive environments, instead of just being integrated into a classroom that is reflective of our actual communities.
All right, we are coming down to the last, few minutes of our show and stuff. So what I usually do is give us some positives, some quick solutions, maybe like steps 1, 2, 3 that we can do as a people. It's almost like when you said the preamble, I put in the chat box, because it's we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect.
It's less than a minute, Jesse. You had
Less than a minute. Okay. So let me say to people, thank you for listening to us. I'll bring Amelia back, because we need to discuss this issue in more detail, especially the box curriculums and the influence of charter schools. But Amelia, quick hello, goodbye. Thank you anyway. I didn't say thank you for helping us to understand a very complicated subject.
Thank you so much for having me. And I would just like to quickly say that I would love to do a pilot project. If any progressive state or district is interested in doing something different, I'd love to hear from you.
All right. And there goes the music. Thank you. Thank you. That's that. Enjoy the weekend, Connecticut. Enjoy the weekend, America.
What it is,
Everyone stay dry and cool.
There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.